So a warm welcome to everyone joining us this evening for this town hall meeting to learn about Remit 01, establish an autonomous national Indigenous organization. I ask everyone to please turn off your video and microphone, and if you are on the phone, please mute yourself by pressing *6. I am Barb Knott, Chair of Canadian Shield Regional Council. With me on screen is David Leighton Brown, past president of Shining Waters Regional Council, who is representing President Tina Conlon. Jody Maltby, regional staff lead for Shining Waters Regional Council, is here this evening, acting on behalf of Peter Hartmans, executive minister for both Canadian Shield and Shining Water. We also welcome and offer sincere thanks to Michael Blair, the General Secretary of the United Church of Canada, who is here to help us understand the background process and intent of this remit. Thank you, Michael, for being with us this evening.
We have 1 hour for this town hall conversation. There are a number of resources to support your consideration of this remit that were shared with you in the lead up to this meeting, including one that answers many frequently asked questions. We hope that you have all looked at the video, and if not, we encourage you to do so, and a link to the video is being placed in the chat right now. Immediately following this town hall conversation, the members of Shining Waters Regional Council will stay on this Zoom call to vote on the remit. The members of Canadian Shield Regional Council will vote on the remit at their regional meeting, which will be held online on Saturday, November the 25th.
I would like to acknowledge our land acknowledgement. The lands where we gather today have been places of gathering for First Nations people as they camped and traveled across the land for generations beyond our knowing. Before people arrived from across the seas, these nations lived, loved, raised children, and made a living. They lived in harmony with all that the Creator had made. As we gather today, we recognize those traditional sojourners in this land. We give thanks for them and for the lands on which we meet. We acknowledge that our history has come at a great cost to the Indigenous community, and we commit ourselves to be partners in healing and reconciliation with understanding and intent.
And I wish to acknowledge that the United Church of Canada, Shining Waters Regional Council, Canadian Shield Regional Council, and this meeting in particular are safe spaces. We not only welcome, but we actively invite the expression of all points of view from all participants, regardless of race, ethnicity, gender, origin, gender identity, or any other form of identity. Because it is only in hearing all voices that we are able to arrive at the truth. I'm going to invite Diane Matheson Jimenez to remind us of our brave commitment, and then we will ask Michael Blair to share why this is an important remit for the church. Following Michael's comments, we will open the floor for questions about the remit.
Good evening, friends. My name is Diane Matheson Jimenez. I use she, her pronouns, and it is my great privilege to serve Canadian Shield and Shining Waters Regional Councils, supporting communities of faith that are managing transitions in their life cycle. A formative moment in my growing up was a creative writing teacher who once said, that nice was the most insidious word in the English language. We can do better than nice. And she meant we can be more creative and we can be more expressive. But what stuck with me is that in our relationships with one another, we can do better and we can be better than nice. And so this evening, as we enter into conversation about this important topic, I invite us not to think about grounding ourselves in being nice, but to ground ourselves in being brave. And I propose we do that by being accountable for the impact both of our words and our silence. To know when it is our time to speak up and when it is our time to hold silence and to listen deeply. To reflect on and name the biases that we all bring into this work. To actively listen, not for the sake of responding, but to more deeply understand the other. To vocalize questions that arise from our learning, and to encounter new ideas with curiosity and wonder, to suspend judgment, and instead be in this space with an approach that honors wonder. May it be so. I am now going to ask our General Secretary, Reverend Michael Blair, to offer some words to our space this evening. Thank you, Michael.
Thanks, Diane. Good evening, folks. It's a privilege for me to be with you and to be able to just kind of offer a bit of a framing for the work related to the Remit. I want to begin by reminding you that in the lead up and in the work around the restructuring of the church, that the 43rd General Council made the decisions in terms of us moving forward. The issue was raised about how does the Indigenous community, the Indigenous Church, fits into the process. And in conversation with the Indigenous leadership, it was agreed that the rest of us would go ahead and do the restructuring that was required, and that the Indigenous Church would catch up. So in some ways, this process is the catching up, as it were, of the Indigenous communities to the restructuring that the church committed itself to. In the process of that restructuring, in 2019, the decision was made to establish a national Indigenous organization. And that organization was given the power of a region as well as a national space. And over the last couple of years, the National Indigenous Organization, which has established the National Indigenous Council and the National Indigenous Elders Council, began to live into its understanding of what it means to be part of the United Church of Canada. As it has been doing that work within the context of the caretaker's call to the church, which was received and approved at the 43rd General Council in Oshawa. And that, the call to the church laid out a framework in which the Indigenous Church would find itself within the context of the United Church of Canada. And so that document, the call to the church, continues to be a framework in which the Indigenous Church lives. It identified the fact that the Indigenous Church would define its own understanding of its spirituality and its spiritual practice. It talked about the fact that the Indigenous Church would also define what it needs in terms of testamer. And so that work has been ongoing. So that is part of the framework. The other part of the framework was that coming out of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, all the churches who had participated in the residential schools was asked to sign on to the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. The United Church of Canada did its work and became a signature to the TRC's request that all the churches sign on to the United Nations Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. One of the qualifiers of that, the UN, UNDRIP as it's called, United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, was the reality of self-determination. That one of the commitments that document called for, and one of the commitments that the United Church has agreed to, was that Indigenous people had the right to self-determination. So I think there are those three things coming at play. The desire to work through and live through the restructuring of the church, the caretaker's call to the church, and the commitment to UNDRIP. So that's a bit of the framing of the moment in which we find ourselves in. On the other side, we recognize that our processes in the life of the church is a colonial one. And it became very clear to us that if we followed the requirements that we had, which was a very colonial practice, that every move that the Indigenous Church made, it would need to come to the larger church to ask permission to make those changes. And we recognized that we were setting ourselves up to replicate a system in which we were trying to move out of. And so in conversation with the NIC and the General Council Executive and moderator Richard Bott at the time and myself, we recognized that one of the ways in which we needed to attend to the change in understanding or change in dynamics of the Indigenous Church within the United Church of Canada, that we needed a way to create a space where the Indigenous Church would have freedom to design and define the way it wants to be within the context of the United Church without having to come back to the larger church every time for permission to do it. So in some ways, Remit 1 is a bit of a preemptive remit, that it creates the space that allows for the Indigenous Church to define its own future. One thing is absolutely clear, is that the Indigenous Church has no intent of walking away and setting up a structure apart from the United Church. One of the things that's very clear for the Indigenous leadership at this point in time is that they want to be a part of the United Church. And the remit is an attempt to help to create the space so they can design what that belonging to the United Church will mean for them. And so there's no anxiety that somehow this remit, if passed, would set the Indigenous Church adrift. It is also an invitation for us to be in the two-row wampum belt of being in our canoes, heading in the same direction on the same river. And so I think it's an important time in the life of the church, because it is creating the opportunity for us to live into our commitments. Our commitment to UNDRIP, our commitment to the caretaker's call to the church, our commitment to decolonize ourselves and to function in a way of mutuality and in reconciliation with the Indigenous communities that make up our church. So it's an important time, and it provides for us, I think, an opportunity to say to the Indigenous Church and its leadership that we are prepared to commit, that our commitment isn't just wishful thinking, that our commitment is indeed lead us to constructive action, so that we want to live the talk that is very critical for us in the life of the church. So that's a little bit of the framing. If there's time, if there's specific questions people have, I'm prepared to answer, but that's just a bit of the framing of this moment and how we've come to this particular time. Thank you.
Yeah, so we'll thank you, Michael, for that. That was very helpful background information, and we do have time for questions. So we'll open the floor now and invite folks who are participating through video. If you'll use your raise hand feature, which is you can find that. You should be able to find that down in the bottom right corner of your toolbar. You can also, if you would find it more comfortable, you can type your question in the chat to Diane, and we'll call on you when it's been identified that you are there. And I'm just going to ask also, before we start, those on the phone, please use *9 to raise your hand, and you can use *6 to unmute yourself. And just to say, this is a time for questions. We'll have the opportunity to speak for or against the remit during our regional meetings, or when you make the decision in your congregation. So right now we're focusing on questions to help us understand better. And we're asking that you start with one question and then make the opportunity for others. And if there's time at the end, we'll invite people to ask a second question. I see that we've got Tracy and then Robert and then Trinity. So we'll start with Tracy.
Good evening. Thank you for this opportunity to ask questions. The first thing that I thought of, while the change is going to be constitutional, it sounds like in the United Church, and allowing the space to occur, I'm also wondering whether the Indigenous Church will have access to assets, United Church assets. My first thought is all the assets that have come available with churches changing and amalgamating, whether they will also be able to, if a church comes up in their area, will they be able to access different assets that we have as building-wise is my first question.
So just to currently, almost all of our Indigenous churches, all the Indigenous churches are on reserves, and there are only few that are in urban centers or outside of reserves. We do have an extensive program of working with communities to address any issues. Most of the communities have property on them already. Most regions have set up a system where percentages of property sale go towards supporting Indigenous ministries. So there is already an access to resources, the resources of the church. Coming out of General Council 43, there is a formula that's been set up in terms of ensuring that the Indigenous Church is resourced And I think there are further conversation that we'll need to have. So in many ways, property is not an issue at this moment for the Indigenous communities. Dollars for programming is probably what's more critical. And already we have systems in place to support financially the work and ministry of Indigenous churches across the country.
Thank you.
I would just like to add to what Michael Blair said. He mentioned that most regions have a policy in place for distributing the assets from property sales. Shining Waters region in particular has a policy for distributing the proceeds from property sales, and Indigenous Ministries Fund is high on that list of priorities as a recipient of those proceeds. I'll let Barbara Knott speak to whatever Canadian Shield is doing.
Again, pretty well what David has said. We do have policies in place to support.
Robert.
It's Bob Hilliard, Bloor Street United Church. Thanks, Michael and everybody. I'm in support of this completely, and I will encourage my church to support it when we get it moved through our church council. But I want to ask a question as how independent will this Indigenous church be compared to the rest of the United Church of Canada? Can they have different points of theology? Can they have different ordinations so that they could ordain someone to the Indigenous church that perhaps wouldn't be ordained in our United Church at the present time? And if they are, for example, ordained in the Indigenous church, do then they become an ordained minister of the United Church as well? So the question is how independent, and the same applies to theology. If they want a different point of theology, which is different than our basis of union.
So thanks, Bob. Our understanding is that, and already the caretaker's call to the church, it is very clear that the Indigenous communities are committed to defining their own spirituality. The reality is that the United Church of Canada is awash, as someone says, and sometime in the past, is awash in theologies. So even with our basis of union, the 1940 statement, the new creed, the Song of Faith, there is a variety of theological expressions in the church. So I don't anticipate that there will be any further additional expressions beyond kind of the breadth of what currently exists. We do know that the Indigenous communities are reclaiming their spirituality. And I think they would be quick to say that in some ways their understanding of God and God in the world is not much different from some of how we would articulate it. There's a different kind of expression. They understand God in everything. They understand how land and everything is interconnected. So there'll be probably different articulation, but not something completely different. I think in conversation with the leadership of the church, they're very, very clear that they are not looking for the opportunity to be radically different from what currently exists now. They just want to be sure that they have the opportunity to make the decisions that are consistent with who they are. And the reality is that we should be talking about Indigenous churches, not an Indigenous church, because the Indigenous Church within the United Church represent a variety of nations, of cultures, and expression. And there's a beauty and a breadth in that. In terms of ordination, they, like all other regions, have the power to ordain based on the recommendation of the Office of Vocation. They do have like other regions, they have a staff person in the Indigenous Office of Vocation. So I think nothing would change drastically from what is now. The piece of the work they're doing on is understanding testamer, and they have a very creative, one of the proposals around how testamer would work is very, very creative, and I'm excited to see how that would get lived out. That's as much as I can tell you without you having a conversation with some of the leadership themselves to give some more expression. But there is no sense that any articulation will be different from the breadth that already exists within the United Church.
Thanks, Michael. Thank you.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. So we'll take Trinity because you've been waiting for a while. Then we'll hear from the folks in the chat, and then we'll come back to the folks with their hands up. So Trinity, if you want to.
Hello, I'm Shane Judge from Trinity, and my question relates to the timing of the remit. I find it a little problematic that the remit hasn't, that what has not been established yet is what the Indigenous leaders have settled, what it means to belong to the United Church. That I'm voting on something that is, in my mind, far too open-ended. I would frame the question in another way. What will remain common to the United Church and the Indigenous Church contemplated by this remit? And that's not been settled by the leadership of the proposed Indigenous Church, and I find that problematic. Can you explain to me why it was not, you haven't held off on this remit until that was settled so we have some better sense of the commonality?
So I would say there are a couple of ways to respond to that. I think the first is to say that this whole process is to try and to get us out of a colonial mindset of dictating to a community how they should function. And so part of it is we want to lean into what it means to decolonize ourselves. The second thing, and by way of illustration, which may be helpful, that when the General Council agreed to restructure the church and to move into regions, there was no blueprint for what those regions were going to look like. And so each region had to meet and figure out how it was going to structure, how it was going to manage the work that was before it. This is quite similar to that, in that I think the Indigenous Church is being given the time to sort out how it wants to function. And what we're trying to do is to say, every change you make, you don't have to come back to us and ask for permission. We're trying to get out of the way of having the Indigenous community always having to ask for permission to be its authentic self. So that's part of the timing issue, is that that's the framing. The other framework is, as you can appreciate, this work has taken longer for the Indigenous Church, partly because it's been living in a space of trauma for the last 3 or 4 years. And you can appreciate the fact that every time there's an announcement about the discovery of graves, it traumatizes the community. And as a leadership in the life of the church, we've been trying to create enough space for the community to deal with the trauma and not have a clock saying you have to figure things out by a certain time. Again, let me just repeat that the commitment, and I was privileged to be part of the National Indigenous Spiritual Gathering at the end of July. The commitment from the communities is to stay within the context of the United Church. And what they need is some time to figure out what that looks like for them. And so we're trying to, again, that's the reason we're trying to create the space. We don't want to be prescriptive like other times in our history. We've created space for communities to figure out how they want to function. And I think the best illustration that comes to mind is the time that was given for the regions to figure out. We have 16 regions, and they're all slightly different in the way in which they approach their life and their work together.
Thank you.
So we'll go to the questions that are in the chat. Diane, do you want to share those with us?
Yes, thank you. A community of faith met this morning and we're discussing the remit, and very practically they'd like to understand, including outreach ministries, how many Indigenous communities of faith are currently in relationship with the United Church of Canada?
There's about 54.
Thank you. And the second question from the chat, you spoke earlier, Michael, about where funding comes from. Could you speak now to what sort of guidelines determine the use of funds?
So I'm probably not prepared to answer that question because in some ways it still feels a very colonial approach. My apologies for that. We regions. So when we restructured the church, we worked out a formula. So each region, there's a formula, the resources are given to the regions. It is up to the regions to, within the framework of assessments, cover governance, M&S cover mission, and service. Those are the kind of two guidelines, and that's the framework that would happen in the Indigenous Church. We don't go around checking to make sure that regions are spending their money. There's a level of trust. The General Council in the 43rd General Council, I think the proposal around funding the Indigenous Church was that the Indigenous Church would be given, I'm going to use an old language, the Indigenous Church would be given kind of a block grant, and it was up to the Indigenous Church to determine how they would spend that without any kind of interference from the rest of us about how it's spent or not spent. We have hundreds of years of colonial oppression to undo, and I appreciate how much of a struggle it is to want to have details and to frame our conversations in the context of what is normative for those of us on the colonial side of the church. But I think it's an opportunity for us, with all the discomfort, to lean into what it means to be the kind of anti-racist, church that's committed to equity, churches that is committed to being an intercultural church. And our commitment to walk in right relationship means that at times we have to hold things lightly and we have to trust the relationship rather than dictating the terms of the relationship.
Thank you so much, Michael. That was really helpful. And a question just came in that I'm going to squeeze in, if that's okay, Jody, because it's sort of adjacent to the question that was just asked. The question's kind of being flipped on its head. Are there financial obligations of the Indigenous Church to the United Church of Canada?
So, like every local communities of faith, where there's assessment and contribution to the M&S, that would be the same.
Thank you.
We're going to go back now to the folks who've got their hands raised. So we've got Robert, and then Evelyn, and then Bill. So Robert.
Hi, thank you. I'd just like to start by saying that, I reacted with horror when I realized I was being asked to agree to be part of an explicitly non-Indigenous church, that is to say, a segregated church. I would like to ask, is there a commitment once the Indigenous church has had more time to figure out how they want to organize and run things, is there a commitment to have that fed back and get to a point where we are no longer have a part of us that is, explicitly ethnically segregated, and we are one non-colonial church? Reforming the colonial structures so that we no longer have to have that distinction. Is there any kind of plan or commitment around that?
So my response, Rob, would be this, that, and again, it's something that the Indigenous Church community has underscored, that this is about a relationship. And so we are engaging in a relationship, and in that relationship, we will figure out bits and bobs. So it's not, we don't have all the I's and the T's dotted. What we're committed to is a journey together. And in that journey together, to learn from each other, to share with each other, and to recognize that diversity can look a million different ways, and we'll live into it. I think it's not there's no blueprint. We're growing into it, just as the way we're growing into how it is that we live and work with racialized folks, how we live with other minoritized folks. It's been a relationship, and so we are slowly being transformed by the relationship we're having, and this is a journey, an invitation to that kind of relationship.
Well, hi there. It's actually my husband Earl who's going to ask a question.
Hi, I'm on the board of the Nobleton United Church, and I just heard of this remit a couple of weeks ago at our last board meeting. So I don't know much about this entire issue, but I would like to learn more about it so I can make an informed decision about it. I guess I'd say that I'm sympathetic to the Indigenous plight and the issues that they have faced and are facing. But several times tonight, and Robert's question just preceding my question sort of touched on it as well. But we've heard the term colonial model is inappropriate for the Indigenous Church to become associated with the United Church of Canada, which leads me to ask the question, well, is our entire structure of the United Church of Canada wrong? If it's so colonial, maybe we should change it so that we don't have to have these remits, that there is more openness or opportunity for various groups. So I just put that out there to see if anyone has a comment on that.
I'll let's see if David or Barbara want to, or Jody. I have a response, but I'll let others speak.
I have no need to speak and would like to hear your answer, but David or Barb may.
No, I'll let Michael answer.
Well, I don't want to throw everything on Michael's shoulder, so let me just an observation. Not everything about the way in which the United Church operates in terms of governance is colonial. In its relationship with Indigenous peoples, it reflects the colonial context of several centuries of experience. But things like rules of procedure, things like deadlines for submission of financial reports and payments of taxes, and all of the ways in which our society operates, however efficiently or inefficiently it does, reflect the context out of which they develop. That doesn't mean that context was wrong in every respect, but the relationship between the dominant society and the Indigenous peoples in Canada was colonial in its character as well as its context.
And I would just add, just a reminder that not always by choice, not by choice, but now by choice, the Indigenous communities have always been part of the church, our predecessor bodies in terms of Methodism and the Presbyterians. And as the relationship has shifted, and remember, this is over 30 years process. So in some ways, it feels like we're being asked to make a change within a year. But remember, this is a 30-plus year process. When the first apology was offered to the Indigenous communities, that apology acknowledged the fact that there was a way in which we, as a dominant church, engaged with Indigenous communities that was destructive. And particularly from the time of the apology, we have been working and living and building a relationship together with the Indigenous communities of this land and Indigenous communities who have associated with the United Church. So it's, in some ways, what it feels like, another analogy, and it may not be, is the kids have grown up. And we we are being asked to have a adult-to-adult relationship with previous folks that we have treated as children. And so that's kind of, excuse the analogy, it's probably a bad analogy, but I think in some ways we're being invited into an adult-to-adult conversation. And so they've been part of us. So we have to figure out what does that mean now to be in a relationship with an adult. And those of us who have adult children know some of the challenge of that. So I think we just need to understand that this is not, and the thing we're trying to get away of, we do not want the Indigenous Church to come cap in hand saying, can we We are trying to create the space to say, you can determine how you want to be, and we're going to create the space to allow you to do that, for that to happen. So it's the Indigenous Church is not new. The United Church has been on this long journey of a relationship, and the relationship has transformed us over the years and is continuing to transform us, and we're being invited in this space of transformation even further.
So I think we're only going to have time for the one more question from Bill, but what I'm going to suggest to other folks who didn't get a chance, if you would type your questions in the chat to Diane and we'll collect them, there is an email address we can submit them to. And if we get the answers, then we can post them on our websites so we can continue to have accessible information for the whole group. So we'll hear from Bill for the final question, and then once it's answered, I'll pass it back to David.
Good evening, everyone. Michael, I want to congratulate you on how you have articulated this very difficult subject. It has touched me immensely, and I have no issue with the theory behind it, the colonialism, why we need to move in this direction. You have done a superb job, a balanced job of explaining to us why we need to move forward with this. I have no issue with that. And I don't have an issue with budget. It came up earlier, and Diane mentioned a couple of questions that came in chat, and she articulated them. I still want to go back to that, however. We have many, many churches in our region that are folding now, low attendance. They can't financially sustain their memberships, and they're folding, unfortunately. In this new structure in the Indigenous Church, will there be a new funding model to support them in this new structure? You mentioned earlier that they have access to the United Church assets and that there's dollars for programs currently in place. But in a new structure, will there not be a new organizational structure? Will there not be new needs and requirements? And if that is the case, how is it proposed that we will be able to continue to fund them, that they are sustainable and we don't set them up for failure?
Yeah, good question. And I think we're all in a space, I think the whole church and what has been agreed to, or the conversations that have been had with Indigenous leadership, is that the resources that we have will be shared as necessary, in the sense that even the non-Indigenous church, we have to be reimagining how it funds itself. You know, you might be aware that currently the General Counsel office is dealing with a $4 million deficit budget for 2023. And we see the numbers in terms of congregational decline. We're still trying to understand all the dynamics around the impact of COVID. So I think the whole system will need to reimagine itself in terms of how it funds itself. And as a part of the United Church, the Indigenous Church is also impacted and will be at the table. They're at the table now in terms of imagining how we deal with the financial challenges of the church. And there are some other conversations that need to be had. There are some communities I know are talking about land back. There are all kinds of questions, but those are conversations that we will have going forward. But I don't think there is in some ways a special way of dealing with a budget when the whole system needs to be retooled. And that's an ongoing piece of work that certainly the General Council Executive is engaged in terms of working through what it means in our context with the kind of financial realities in which we face. And so all of us are impacted by the non-Indigenous and the Indigenous Church, and we'll work it through together. So again, there's no formula. We will be in conversation and out of the relationship determine what's appropriate.
Thank you.
Well, we have come to the end of this town hall gathering. Once again, we offer our thanks to Michael Blair for helping us to understand the significance of this remit in our journey toward right relations and justice for Indigenous people.
We hope that this has been helpful as you prepare to vote in your local communities of faith and at your regional council. In a moment, we'll close with a blessing, and then those who are not staying for the Shining Waters meeting can exit. Those who are staying can take a quick all-purpose break if necessary. Please be back for 7 o'clock. We'll also open the chat, and people can turn on your video and microphones if you wish to say goodbye to one another. But first, I invite Melody Duncanson-Hales on behalf of the Right Relations team to offer a blessing on this time together. Melody.
Good evening, friends. I join you tonight from Sudbury, Ontario, where I am gathered with a group here at St. Peter's United Church. It is my honor to serve the Canadian Shield Regional Council Right Relations team, and to also bring regrets from our team lead, Lisa Blair. I wanted to offer a few words from Richard Wagamis in his book, One Drum. Respect, he writes, is the ability to honor all creation. It is something you offer and something that you carry with you. The spiritual blessing of respect is harmony, and the spiritual byproduct is community. Respect and living respectfully is the act of bestowing honor on the process of living. It is the principle that makes the continuation of the great circle of teachings possible. Without respect, without a sense of the inherent value of all, a spiritual journey becomes a directionless wandering. May we take our leave this evening with our hearts opened, our spirits humbled, acknowledging the wisdom that all teaching brings to our understanding of reverence, respect, and discernment. May we remember that respect, like all breath and all that connects us, like the circle of life, is where giving precedes receiving. May our considerations and our actions all stem from profound respect for all our relations. Let us be guided by the principles of humility, courage, wisdom, allowing us to see beyond ourselves and comprehend our sacred role in the balance of our life. Let our spiritual journey as both individuals and as a church be not directionless wandering, but a guided path towards respect, trust, understanding, and harmony. Blessed be. Amen.